So this is my first slide. It's a statement. People have the right to be involved in decisions that affect their lives. I don't know what people think of that statement. Does that seem contentious? Or just kind of like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I don't know. I mean, I don't think people currently do have the right. I mean, it's not enshrined in any kind of law or anything. I'm not sure there's a human right up there that says people should be involved in decisions. But it seems like a really good idea. And this is what we have printed on the back of our business cards at work. And we have it on a great big piece of plastic in the office. And we print it on tablecloths and things like that. So it's kind of a thing that we believe in. Let's see which way does the click work. Way. Who are we? We're Aptivate. We are a consensus-based cooperative. We have an office just over there in Hove, and we have one in Cambridge. We work in software. We build software in the international development sector, and we've been doing that for 15 years now. And that's me. This photo was taken just after the office party, which is why I'm looking a bit rough there. So I want to talk a little bit about decision making. Does anybody recognize this picture? Does this speak to anyone? So this is the first kind of form of decision making I wanted to talk about. So you're in your workplace. This is your pointed-haired boss here coming in with a shiny new thing. In this case, it's a CRM system. I've got a new CRM system. We're all going to use that. And these, no, I wasn't asked on that. So this is it in a small scale. Has anybody kind of experienced any kind of thing like this? I see lots of nodding. Yeah. This kind of thing happened to me, maybe not with the CRM system. I think I have to hold the mic in a certain way. But sometimes it happens on a bigger scale, not just in the office. I tried this slide out last night with my wife. It's like, yeah, she goes, is that Prince Charles? It's like, no, that's not. He has got big ears, though. I don't know if you can tell who that is. Anyone? Brilliant. Okay, so this kind of form of decision making, if you like, you might call autocracy. One person has an idea. I'm going to do it, and I don't really have to consult anybody. I can just do it. So what can we do better than that, especially when that goes wrong? Well, the next thing people talk about often would be majority rule. So this is where a whole bunch of people will put up their hands and say, yeah, I'm for that, and whatever the majority goes for, that's what we'll do. So here's just probably a really awful example, but a little thing I dreamt up, of how majority rule doesn't always kind of work here. So he hasn't got pointy hair now. Boss comes in. I've got this great idea for a new office. I love steps. I want an office high up on steps. What do you reckon? Anybody in? Yay! The majority of people go, whoa, let's have an office high up on steps. But there's one person, at least here, who's not so impressed with this idea. So how are they represented in majority rule? Is this working for them? And this is at a small scale, but that kind of thing can happen in a bigger scale. Again, I tried this slide out last night, and my wife's saying, it's a bunch of islands. It's like, no, that's not a bunch of islands. That's the European flag there. No, it has yellow stars. Those are green. Well, my daughter doesn't have a yellow crayon, so I was, sorry. Hopefully you can kind of get a bit topical. So here we go. Autocracy, majority rule. Is there anything else? Can we do any better than that? I mean, coming back to our original kind of idea, our original kind of mission, vision, thought that we have printed on our tablecloths that people should have a say in decisions that affect them, is there anything else? Well, there is a thing that we've been trying called consensus. So does anybody know about consensus decision making? Yay! Or consent decision making, or both. Does anybody use it regularly? Fantastic. There's a couple of people. All right. So I have something to say. So here's consensus. And here's consensus as it's defined in the dictionary, if you like, or some dictionary definition I found online. Consensus, general agreement or accord, unanimity. And when we first started dabbling with this idea at work, this is kind of what we had, I guess, in our heads. But as we kind of looked into it more, we found that no, that's not really what I'm talking about. Not the dictionary definition, but consensus, if you like, with a capital C. So there's various forms of decision-making that follow this pattern, or follow a pattern a bit like this. There's like consent decision-making and formal consensus, which is a type of consensus decision-making. If you like, that has a capital C. So this is a process, not the dictionary definition. And here is my kind of boiled down, simple version of that process. So nobody who kind of really worked on or invented these ideas would probably recognize my diagram and go, yeah, that's it. So I'm not trying to kind of train you how to do this, but just kind of give a flavor or give a kind of interest in this idea. But it's kind of this idea. So you have to have a proposal. You have to have a thing that you're attempting to make a decision about. There are other processes for coming up with those ideas. If you have a really thorny problem at work and you just don't know what the answer might be, there's all sorts of other processes, group kind of creative processes that you can facilitate that will help you come up with a proposal, but I'm not talking about those today. This is just about taking the decision. So you have to start with a proposal. And then you enter this circle, and you can kind of, depending on which you're following, where's a good place to stand? Can I leap around? You can kind of come into this circle in different places, and different processes come in here and there. But let's start over here. So you have a proposal, and you go in, and you ask anybody, does anybody have any concerns with this proposal? You raise concerns. You list concerns. It's kind of a good thing to have concerns. You're telling people it's absolutely fine. In fact, bring them on. Give us your concerns. And then you address the concerns in this process. And the way you address concerns pretty much universally is that you amend the proposal. You tweak it, you change it, you kind of move it about a little bit. And then when you've done that, you then kind of test for objections. So, can we live with this? Does anybody object? Will anybody like just really give up if we did this? And if you've got no objections, hooray, we've got a decision. It sounds hopefully kind of simple. So when I talk about consensus with people, one of the first things that I hear is that, well, that's going to take forever, isn't it? I mean, it sounds like a great idea, but in business, we need to make decisions, and we need to make decisions now. We need to be fast, we need to be innovative, or pff, we've had it. This is what a consensus meeting would surely look like. Well, no. So I wanted to kind of dispel that myth, first of all. And there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, you can practice this and get pretty good at it. And so there's no necessity for it being slow, and I'm just asking you to believe me on that. But also, there's that kind of, if you like, the total time of a decision. So it's possible, especially in an autocratic kind of scenario, where you can make a decision very quickly, but you have to implement that decision. So you might make an unpopular decision, but you need to force people to do it. They might not want to, so there's a whole convincing thing. They might rebel against that decision. That decision might not really come out, and then in the end, it might even have been a bad decision, or without the nuance that will make it really succeed. So there's this whole extra amount of time that's outside of that kind of decision process that consensus can kind of really help, because it makes a better decision in the first place. Another thing that you might hear is like, well, kind of like consensus, it's kind of mediocre, isn't it? You're not going to have any like visionary insights with consensus. It's just kind of like a mediocre, kind of in the middle. Well, it's not too offensive and it's not too this is my meh slide. And again, I'm going to go nip back. This is the magic bit. The concerns make the proposal, the idea, better. That's why we invite them. You draw out the concerns, you address the concerns, and what happens is it's like this kind of successive approximation to the answer. The proposal just gets better and better, adding in little bits of more nuance that make it a better idea and more implementable, more testable, more valuable, and so on. So it isn't a way of just coming up with mediocre decisions. So the other thing I wanted to use to kind of persuade you that, oh, actually, this might work for real, is give a tiny little bit of a history. You know, this does have a history. So one strand of the history of consensus decision-making we can trace back to, say, the 17th century. And there's two kind of parallel strands there. You've got the Quakers, who were really kind of instigating and using this method of decision-making in the 17th century, as well as the Iroquois council, the kind of government, if you like. And then how did that get from there to kind of the thing that we're doing and using? Well, there's two people that have kind of indirectly really, I suppose, influenced us at Aptivate and my thinking. So one is Gerard Endenberg from Endenberg Electrotechnique. So I don't know if anybody's heard of them. Have you heard of sociocracy, anyone? So this is really where the sociocratic method of governance, which is a kind of flat structure that uses consent decision-making in the middle of it, had come from. So Gerard had been taught in a Quaker school where he, as a student, was participating in decisions of the school. That's how he kind of grew up. He inherited the family electronic business in the 70s and thought there must be a better way. And came up with this sociocratic circle method, which has consent decision-making in the middle of it. That's not so much the strand, actually, that we in Aptivate follow, but it's a very good one to look up. A bit later than that, we have C.T. Butler from Food Not Bombs, who trained the guy that trained me in consensus. And he had kind of independently kind of come up with a thing in the sense that he was studying the activist movement, particularly the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s in the US, and looking at what kind of decision processes worked in these different affinity groups and which one didn't. And out of that kind of study, wrote this manual on consensus decision-making called Formal Consensus. But interestingly, a lot of those activist groups have a kind of influence or root going back to the Quakers again. So again, trying to persuade you this might be a reasonable idea. These are companies that use it. So another question that seems to happen is like, so use this consent. Oh, sounds interesting. Okay, you've convinced me it could work, and it doesn't always come up with mediocre stuff, but it's not going to scale. I mean, how big are you? And we go, Aptivate, we're kind of 10 people. Well, there you go. You couldn't do it with 11, could you? It'd never work. But I want to tell you that it does. So Endenberg, the sociocratic guys, they're like 500 employees. And most impressive, I think, is the neighborhood parliaments of India that work in a hierarchical consensus structure with hundreds of thousands of people in that network working this way. You've got Outlandish in London, who are kind of friends of ours. Bright Interactive in Brighton, right here, who are using sociocracy and consent decision-making. Anybody from Bright here? What's that little finger? No, right. And in Spiral in New Zealand, who are kind of a network of organizations that also run themselves by consensus, which I think there are about 300 people at the moment. So, Aptivate. This is us doing it, actually. I mean, this is a few years old, this picture, but this is us in one of our meetings where we would be doing this process. But it wasn't always like that. So when we first set up Aptivate 15 years ago, for the first 4 or 5 years, we've always been a not-for-profit, but we're a company limited by guarantee, and we had a board of directors, and initially that was 4 people in the company. We're on the board of directors. And 2 of the directors were particularly vocal. And that one's me. I was one of those vocal directors. And so our decision-making process, we thought we were using consensus back in the kind of dictionary definition days. Yeah, we kind of had everybody in the meeting. We wouldn't do anything that would really annoy people. But the way these meetings kind of played out was like, we just shouted at each other. So I would shout one way, and this would be my colleague Dom, and he would shout the other. And when I wanted an idea, I already knew, my hackles were already up even before going into the meeting. Dom was going to react in a certain way. I don't know what hackles are. I think they're kind of poisonous green spines down my back, but they were definitely up. And so we're his. And I know what he's going to do. He's going to want to pull it this way. He wants to have like more hierarchy or more this, more that. Oh, the slippery slope. Oh. And so we'd kind of be really arguing. And what I hadn't really noticed at first was that all the other people in the organization, they'd just be kind of sitting, watching, going, oh, mummy and daddy are fighting again. And eventually one of us would win, yay, and the decision would be taken. But it had this kind of, you go home just feeling really crappy, shouting at work again. But like I said, we kind of thought we were using consensus, but then we adopted this process. So I got some training and we formally adopted the process. And it changed everything, and it changed everything almost overnight. It was really profound. And one of the first things that happened was this sense of ego goes. And let me try and explain why. So what happens is, one of us will bring in a proposal, hey, we should do this. Can't think of a proposal off the top of my head, but hey, let's move office. And we'd raise concerns. So the whole group, Sal, is empowered and even encouraged to start to have a say and have a dialogue. We'd start to address these concerns, which means we start to edit the proposal. Straight away, almost immediately, within minutes, that proposal is no longer really owned by the person who put it in. It's become a group thing. We all own it. We all got a bit of a hand in tweaking it and changing it. And that means that very quickly, the dialogue moves away from my idea, and you're attacking my idea, to this, our idea, and what's the best way of doing this? So it kind of gets rid of that ego thing. But also just these subtle, almost like tricks of language, this thing where you can say, does anybody have any concerns? It's making it okay. It's a very gentle language. It makes it okay for people to speak up and say, oh, I could see a danger here, or this might not work. And again, this kind of removes that sense of ego. It very quickly moves us towards a kind of collaborative building of the proposal, whatever that might be. We're building this thing together. We're all kind of invested in it. And it makes us listen. Because everybody in consensus has a right to be heard and can have an objection at the end. It's not that people really do object. I mean, I can't think in our history of any time where anybody's blocked a decision in 10 years of using this method. But they have the right. And it's a bit like an insurance. It means because everybody has this right to have a say in this decision in this way and could stop it, you have to listen to everyone. And because you will be listened to, and there is a point in the process where that will just naturally happen, you don't have to start fighting at the beginning to be heard. You can wait. It's okay. You will have your chance to have a say. And we all have to listen, because we can't just ignore a concern somebody's raising, because then at the end, when we test for objections, there may be an objection and we can't move forward. So my wife did recognize who this was, the Queen. So when we first formally adopted this and wrote this into our Articles of Association, we were a bit like the Queen. We still had a board of directors. We said the organization would run by consensus. But we were worried. What if we couldn't reach a consensus? What if we were mired by blocks and ongoing processes? So we had a clause in there that said, well, if the organization failed to reach a consensus, or a decision, if you like, the directors could take that back and make it themselves. In which case, the kind of default thing in our legal structure was that, well, the directors work by majority rule. So we could just take back that decision and do that. And this is why I think we're a bit like the Queen, because as far as I understand, the Queen has the ability to dissolve Parliament if she fancies, anytime. It's like, if she did, I think people would be a bit upset. I don't think she'd really get away with it. And we started to realize after a while that as this decision-making process was embedded into our culture, that while that power was sort of on the statutes, it was useless. We couldn't use it. If we did take it back to the directors and say, we're making this decision, we'd lose all the buy-in of our organization, people would leave. So we couldn't do it. So in the end, that clause that we put in, because we thought, oh, we didn't need it. It's not needed. It wasn't helpful. We'd never used it. And I think we've probably scrubbed it out by now. The snail. The happy snail. So the other thing that we found is that, well, sometimes actually decisions were slow. Sometimes we couldn't just instantly make this decision. People did have concerns. And what happened is when we reflected back on some of the slow decisions, we realized that thank goodness they were slow. If we just kind of charged off in the directions that we were talking about, bad things would have happened. So occasionally it does slow down the process, but in a good and happy way. And then we come on to the technology bit. So, like I say, we've been using this method for about 10 years. Some years ago, we thought for the smaller issues in particular, for issues that we'd like to kind of get done quickly, and we had a distributed team, wouldn't it be great to have an asynchronous process? Some kind of tool that you could use online, that you could do maybe the smaller decisions so they wouldn't take up meeting time and so on. And we built a thing. We built a thing called e-consensus for doing this. We tried it on email, could not do it over email at all. Something about the way you just couldn't do it. Tried it in wikis and documents, no. So we built this tool. Hooray! We built it quite a while ago. Since then, Lumio, one of the companies in the Inspiral lot, have come up with a much fancier and prettier tool, which is this. But we built ours before this happened, so we kind of built our own. And we used it all the time. It was very interesting. And then a thing started to happen. So this is kind of a story of the promise of technology, but some of the dangers. And we started to get to that uncover that kind of next order of kind of detail here. So this is a proposal. I've kind of edited it a little bit. There's a proposal I put forward on e-consensus at one point when we were going through quite a bad, kind of a difficult financial time, where basically I said, let's turn off consensus now. This caused a certain amount of debate, and I've reworded it eventually to maybe we should be mindful of how we're using e-consensus. But basically what we had sort of noticed is a couple of things. One is that this kind of text-based online forum type thing descends a little bit into flame wars because that's what text-based online forum things seem to do. And this doesn't happen face-to-face and in our meetings or on the phone or on Skype or on Hangouts or anything, but it did start to happen here, especially under stress. So that is a thing that I think needs countering somehow. And we haven't worked out exactly how to do it with an online sort of tool yet. But the second thing, which I think is kind of more subtle and kind of interesting, is this. My wife couldn't work this one out at all. This is the currency of time. If time were a currency, there you go. I'll give you 10 minutes. Thank you. Here's your change. And thank you all. There's an enormous amount of donation of time you're doing for me right now. What we also came to realize was that the people who weren't so busy could spend more time on the asynchronous tool, putting in proposals, commenting on proposals, having great flame wars and doing all that. And people who felt really busy or stressed started to feel excluded from that process. Like, when's it supposed to happen? Especially because at work we have this kind of what we call the anti-long hair culture, which actually means that we don't like long hours. We want people to, I don't know why it turned into hair, but obviously you can see it's had an effect. But the idea is we didn't want to do that technology startup thing where everybody works till midnight every day and over the weekend. We wanted to go home sustainably. We wanted to build a sustainable employer, be humane to each other, all of that. So time was important. And what was interesting about our meetings was that this was sanctioned time by our employer, by each other, to come together for a day, for half a day, for an hour, whatever that was, and to spend that time in that meeting making that decision. And we got through as much of the agenda as we got through, and if we didn't get through it, we didn't get through it, and that was okay. That's what happened. If we didn't manage to make the decision, that's okay. But that's the time you were allowed, and it was an equitable allowance of time. But the offline tool, It's like, okay, maybe you're really, really stressed and busy at work, but maybe you just want to go home and do this all night, while your colleagues might want to go home and do other things outside of work. Who'd have thought? Apparently some people do that. So this became a very interesting idea. Like, how does that time thing, when we have a meeting, we've explicitly made this decision that it's okay to spend this time doing this thing, but with these asynchronous tools, it all gets a bit startup culture-y and let's do this all night long. And we weren't really down with that. So that's another issue that seems to need to be resolved with these kind of online decision-making tools that, again, we haven't found the answer to yet, but I still think there's a lot of promise here. And this kind of really made me have this kind of idea, have this thought. It's quite a recent thought, really. It's just really come into my consciousness over the last few days, reviewing all of this. But many of you, I've imagined, have heard of the term of servant leadership or servant management. Does that kind of ring any bells? But there's this kind of idea, and we've been doing it where, I mean, loads of people do this, where a manager, like a project manager, or cool, thank you, isn't seen as some overlord to the people that they're managing, but rather they're providing a service. And this is very much like the culture in our workplace, that our developers love it when they have a project manager, because the project manager provides these services. It means they can carry on doing a lot of coding and the kind of things that they like to do, while somebody's looking after some other kind of things that they don't like to do as much. And we swap these roles around, and we all get paid the same. So it's not like anybody has the right to tell anybody what to do, or anybody is somehow more important than anybody else. It's just that this management role is a service role to the people who are trying to do the thing. That's kind of servant leadership. But when I started thinking more about this time thing and decision-making, coming up with this idea really of servant employer. Like, what is an employer anyway? If we've already got consent decision or consensus decision-making, if we have a flat hierarchy and we're all in this together, what is the organization? I think there's this big dialogue in business, and it's even like on your contract, that the employee is the servant of the employer. You know, that there's this big company that's going to go on, and its existence is vital. And people will come, and people will go, and the company can use those people, and it will pay them a little bit of money for their time. But it's the company that we serve. And I started to realize there is no company, there's only us. So why are we all come together? Why are in this, you know, when we're at work, why are in this room together? What are we doing? And we're co-conspiring to provide each other a livelihood. That's why we're there. We're supporting each other. And that's what I started to realize, that like Aptivate isn't a thing. It's not really a company. It might be a legal entity. It's a thing that we make. But why do we bother making it? We make it because we care about each other and we care about ourselves, and it's just a vessel, a way of us helping each other have a productive livelihood together. And so the relationship of time to employment is really important, and it's one I'm still kind of really exploring. And how time feeds into decision-making is important, and we haven't worked that out, how you do that online yet. So coming back, recapping in the last 2 minutes, here's the process again. Make a proposal, raise the concerns, address your concerns, test for any objections. If there's no objections, I'll move on. Nobody's objecting. So here's a kind of some reading, if you want to look at this. So look up Google consensus or consent decision making. They're different, they're subtly different, but they're good, either one. Formal consensus is what we're pretty much tending towards in Aptivate. Sociocracy is a really interesting method, and it scales very nicely to larger organizations, which has consent decision making, which is more or less the same, unless you were talking to these two people, in which case they would tell you about the differences. And my last slide. So we're not always, like even in Aptivate, when we do this internally, we have to work with our clients who are often deeply hierarchical. And many of you might not be in organizations where you can just instantly kind of, hey, I've got this great idea, let's all become consensus driven. So sometimes I find I have to do this by stealth, and this is what I wanted to leave you with. And it's very subtle, but sometimes I'm in client meetings we're doing, and it might be a deeply hierarchical organization, and we have people from all over that organization represented as stakeholders. We're trying to build software for them and so on. And I just use this little turn of phrase every so often. Would anybody object if we did this? It's just one part of the consensus process. It's not the whole thing. But even just using that phrase, turning it around from sort of saying, does everybody agree, to like, does anybody not agree? It makes a huge difference. And you can just slip this in and get away with it. And it starts moving towards a world where people have a right to have a say in things that affect them. Thank you.